Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги, дамы и господа.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are continuing with our conference, Protecting the Future, and it is a great honor for me to welcome all of the speakers and all of the delegates. Russia represents an agency which is responsible for the combat against antisemitism, xenophobia, and racism, all of these things which can destabilize the society. That is why we believe that these are the priorities in our professional activities. We believe that only through consolidation of international organizations, governments, and societal movements, we can work effectively to combat all of this. Today we have gathered at the Protecting the Future conference. Therefore, to protect the future, we need to start working with children, with youngsters, and we do quite a lot here at the federal level in Russia. We have a government program that embodies all of these principles. We firmly believe that it is extremely important that we need to ensure the right mindset. It should be a leitmotif going through all of our work, and this is a central part of our agenda. Today we have a very representative plenary session. We believe and confirm by the Russian example, we believe in the idea that each country needs to create special agencies working with these issues. Also, each country needs to have a special institute or ombudsperson. I would like to give the floor to Brankica Jankovic, who is the Commissioner for the Protection of Equality of Serbia. And Brankica will speak to us online.
Can I start now? Yes. Is everything okay?
Yes,
Do you hear?
Is good.
Can you hear me?
You're online. Yes, please, we're ready.
Спасибо. Добрый день. Good afternoon. First of all, let me congratulate on a very well-organized conference in a hybrid format, and I'm very sorry that due to epidemiological situation, I'm not able to attend in person. The world is entering into a new period, which I personally, and I believe that is true for the majority of others as well, still do not fully understand. Of course, the world has changed throughout its history, but these changes have never been so fast, nor have they been transmitted so quickly from one end of the world to the others. Without an intention to enter into a philosophical debate, my dominant impression is that people were not ready for all these global changes, and that are largely conditioned by the rapid technological development. I see this lack of readiness as a crisis of fundamental social values that almost all nations are facing to a greater or a lesser extent. This is confirmed by a large number of researches in recent years that unequivocally warn of the growth of antisemitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racism. And it's alarming that new generations actually know and understand less and less about great tragedies that marked the 20th century. It turned out that the era of great wars may have ended with the last century, but that hating others, hating those who are different and who have been marked by the hatred has not disappeared. it's just changed its shape. The tendency of growth of these retrograde processes coincides with passing of the last witnesses of the Holocaust, accelerated by the migrant crisis and followed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has not contributed either to reducing the fear of the new and the unknown. Unfortunately, the pandemic has opened up a field of new division and created space for new irreversible processes. The combination of pandemic, isolation, and social networks served as an amplifier for xenophobic and anti-Semitic outbursts in the form of large number of posts with unacceptable contents. In parallel with strengthening of hate speech, there was an explosion of quasi-information, false news, conspiracy theories, leading to dangerous processes of erosion of trust in state institutions and official attitudes. The worrying fact that I have heard of recently is that in August, 400,000 video clips, were removed from TikTok because of inappropriate contents. All this points to the complexity of the problems we are facing. Social networks and the internet have by now become increasingly recognizable as particularly controversial by all of us because apparent anonymity enables extremists to turn almost rampant and turn digital battlefield to become more and more appropriate for what we are facing now. However, I'm afraid that is just a tip of an iceberg, and that we often cannot follow and discover all the hate speech that reaches its target group, and that is mainly the group of young people. The so-called safe oasis in seemingly innocuous things can become a potential source of extremism, such as a children's room with computers, video games, social networks, and various others platforms. Then sports playgrounds and events that we used to see as a safe haven for children became a potential danger as well. Even the sanctuaries are not completely safe because although they propagate love, peace, and tolerance, there are extreme forms of religious interpretations which can turn into their opposite. It's very important that the European Commission also recognized the seriousness and that is presented the first EU strategy for the fight against anti-Semitism and for the nurturing of Jewish life. It's good. It's only one of mechanisms to have an international European level framework, but I think that we need international global document. And also the role of independent bodies for protection against discrimination is essential too, both in the proactive approach and in detecting negative tendencies in order to stop or prevent them in time. And Commissioner Jourova emphasized during her previous mandate and call the equality bodies as a guardians of justice and equal opportunities. If the view of the global level is lowered towards the local level, it certainly would not be possible for me to say that the Republic of Serbia is an isolated island. However, in Serbia for now, we cannot talk about the growth of anti-Semitism, although there are isolated incidents that need to be analyzed very seriously, of course. We have had several incidents in recent years, over which we have issued a public warning in 7 cases in accordance with our mandate. These mostly had to do with graffiti and drawing of Nazi symbols on public surfaces. but they would single out as particularly inadmissible the recent use of yellow ribbons by anti-vaccine protesters who wanted to identify with Jews, or an attack on a crisis staff doctor whom they compared with Nazi Dr. Mengele. As institutions, we are trying to condemn all similar incidents so as to demonstrate that there should be no tolerance for such cases and to call attention to the harmfulness of such phenomena. One of the reasons why we do not register growth of anti-Semitism in Serbia is the great suffering of the Serbian people in the 20th century during both world wars. However, what is worrying here is that perpetrators of these isolated incidents mostly consider themselves as the guardians of the Serbian tradition. But these incidents may also provide a solution because they show that the problem is that the bad pupils behaved as leaders who were giving lectures to others, while in reality, had they truly cared about their ancestors and had they listened to the testimonies of their ancestors and the lectures at school, they would have known that the Jews from Serbia shared the fate of the Serbian soldiers in the First World War, and that the Serbs in the Second World War died in the camps precisely with Jews who were suffering next to them. Working with young people, primarily with children, I noticed that they did not know the meaning of certain symbols and used them frequently thinking that they were cool. After reviewing an explanation, they felt ashamed. Also, I can proudly say that the migrant crisis has not contributed to the growth of xenophobic mood, despite the attempts of some smaller extremist association to spread fear through the networks or by self-organizing, for which we also responded with warnings. The migrant crisis in Serbia is actually an example of how responsible rhetoric of political factors and condemnation of spreading false news can prevent violence. All of the above does not leave me much more room for dilemma when thinking about a solution. The only solution is education, and of course more education through formal and informal methods. And in that process, we must not leave behind the institutions of high academic education, and youth-friendly education and educational content must be a starting point and key response to growing extremism. As an institution, we are trying to approach to the young people, bringing in some interactive content that is closer to their way of thinking. I would like particularly to point out for the end of my words, I'll point out to the panel of the young, as well as young terminators of discrimination, who aim to recognize and report discrimination and inequality in their communities. That is one of the ways to familiarize children with this topic, since they understand better the language of their peers than our vocabulary that is sometimes over bureaucratic. I would also like to mention the project Living Library, which is shown to have significant potential. Conceived in such a way that people, instead of talking about books, tell their stories and what they face because of their different skill, colors, religion, nationalities, age, disability, etc. Thank you very much for.
Thank you, Brankica. We are grateful for your kind report and for your participation.
And we continue with our discussion. First of all, the goal of the plenary meeting is to formulate certain impetus that will serve as a foundation for the work of subsequent sessions. Recently, in Moscow, the Forum of the Nations of Russia has been held in Moscow, which united the representatives of 193 nations and ethnicities, also with the participation of the representative of the Foreign Ministry, including Marina Zakharova, and the agenda, which is shared by the entire world, has been discussed at the plenary session. And today, here with us, we have Deputy Director of the Department for Humanitarian Cooperation and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergey Chumarev. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear organizers of the conference. Preceding the official statements that have been delivered here, I would like to contribute as an expert into one of the most topics of this forum. First of all, I would like to try to give a review of an overview of those legislational measures appearing as in the course of the process of combating anti-Semitism as one of the forms of racism and ethnic and discrimination. I believe that at the current stage we have to estimate the legislative activity by the international organizations and on the national level, and to find out why, despite such tremendous work and considerable diplomatic and political efforts, we still see the growth of anti-Semitism in the majority of regions, with the exception of just a few states, of whom Russia is a proud member. Probably there are certain issues, political or legislative or legal, which prevent the implementation of the number of resolutions of the so-called soft law, which is accepted at the international level, and on the level of direct action by the UN, OSCE, Council of Europe, which lie in the foundation of anti-discrimination legislation, both civil code and criminal code. I believe that the low effect of these efforts is due to the fact that the regulations developed by the politicians who are combating the discrimination, they find hard time, these norms find hard time to root themselves in the heads of those people who are committing these crimes. There is a gap in understanding of the importance of recommendations developed by the importance of the recommendations and the importance of applying those recommendations in our daily life. In that respect, I would like to emphasize that probably countries should pay more attention to the principle of inevitability of punishment for criminal violations. Unfortunately, we have to admit, based on the example of the number of EU countries, and today we've heard from the representative of the European Commission, we have to admit that the persecution, both administrative and criminal, of individuals who are guilty in anti-Semitism are still an exception rather than the rule in the court practice of European countries. There is a huge gap here, which I have mentioned, and here the large role has to be played by the community, by the branches of the World Jewish Congress, and by the human rights organizations which are combating modern forms of racism, to spread internationally accepted norms among the students, among community at large, among society, among politicians, because as we know, sometimes a statement by a public leader, which is not punishable, sometimes becomes a trigger or an example for masses at large. One other thing I'd like to mention is that the existence of formal legal obstacles for criminal prosecution of individuals who committed anti-Semitic crimes or war crimes or crimes against humanity. Some countries with a well-developed judicial system, unfortunately, are quoting their legislation, which does not allow them to run the criminal persecution of perpetrators of the Holocaust crimes unless those crimes have been committed in the territory of these countries or affected the citizens of those countries. Yes, this is a quite serious legal challenge which the Jewish organizations persecuting the perpetrators of Holocaust crimes have confronted. And I have to emphasize that the Russian law enforcement agencies and the Foreign Ministry of Russia are working in close cooperation with the Jewish organizations promoting this issue, and they provide the necessary information for criminal persecution of the individuals who committed war crimes with no expiration term. In the recent years, in the Russian society, in the legal culture of Russia, the grounds to promote the topic of genocide of the ethnic groups of the former Soviet Union during the Second World War. As we know, there are lower decisions or court decisions on the lower level which might subsequently influence the development of the legislation. And on our part, I have to mention significant contribution of the Investigative Committee and the Office of Attorney General of Russia, who are currently involved in designing amendments to Russian legislation. And we believe that this work should take into account the experience accumulated by the Jewish organizations and should definitely be run with respect to the graves of Holocaust victims and to affect all the ethnicities and nations of the former Soviet Union who once were part of the united community, regardless of their social, ethnic, national or religious affiliation. We believe that this work will be an important contribution of Russia and of Russian judicial system in combating of the modern forms of racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia, and in restoration of historic memory of the huge victims suffered victims and sacrifices suffered by the Jewish people, by the Russian people in their struggle against Nazism. I think that this important work should go on because probably for Holocaust victims and for their relatives, the war is not over until the last perpetrator and last person guilty in crimes against humanity is put to trial. And in conclusion, I would like to wish all of you fruitful work, and I hope that our experience, the Russian experience, the experience of the Russian Jewish Congress will be an important contribution into international effort of combating anti-Semitism. Thank you. Thank you, Sergey. As you said, the development of international legislation is very important and definitely depends on the personalities of the level of their education there and of their readiness to preparedness to promote these legislative norms. To get here with us is a high-level expert, Fernando Lottenberg, Organization of American States Commissioner to monitor and combat anti-Semitism.
Good afternoon. I'd like, first of all, to thank the Russian Jewish Congress, the person of Mr. Yuri Kanner and the Executive Director Anna Bolshitskaya for having me here. This is the first trip that I'm making since I was nominated by Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, last October, last month, to be its first commissioner to monitor and combat anti-Semitism in the Americas. It also has an emotional ground because my two grandmothers were born in Russia, so I'm coming back to my roots. My mandate items, as defined in the resolution of the OAS, will be the structuration of a database of the incidents in the region, court decisions, governmental policies, conceiving and designing measures to increase the level of knowledge of past and present manifestations of anti-Semitism and the danger they pose to democracy in the region, and to stimulate member states and organizations to adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism already adopted by OAS itself. We intend to take the debate about anti-Semitism, as you are doing here, outside of the Jewish communities with a social, national, and a regional approach. I believe that anti-Semitism cannot be seen as a phenomenon that happens in the vacuum, nor it was brought to our societies by extraterrestrials. It's a symptom of something deeper, of a social trend that has to be analyzed as a threat to democracy and a violation of human rights. Minorities must be respected and be assured a life with security where they can thrive and flourish. One of the sides of the so-called traditional anti-Semitism with a neo-Nazi or right-wing background has been watched in some countries of our continent. A certain self-assurance that those thoughts can be exposed freely and publicly, be it in a verbal way or through violent acts, such as we have seen in the march in Charlottesville or in Pittsburgh with the shooting of 11 people at the synagogue Tree of Life 3 years ago. On the other side of the political spectrum, we have seen objections directed to the State of Israel policies reaching dangerous levels, not limited to a government's decisions critique, but questioning the very existence of the state itself and its delegitimization. As Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the Anti-Defamation League CEO, mentioned a week ago, anti-Semitism on the left is similar to climate change. His words, slowly but surely, the temperature is rising. There are occasional storms, but too often people choose to ignore the signs and deny that there is a pattern. By all measures, the metaphorical temperature is climbing, the condition is worsening, and this situation threatens to upend life as we know it. In both cases, we see anti-Semitism being normalized and becoming mainstream, as if it were a legitimate discourse and being instrumentalized to be used as a political tool in a fight against the other side, left versus right, much more than a problem that needs to be faced and addressed. During these 2 last weird years, I would like to mention 2 issues that had a direct impact on anti-Semitism. The first, the pandemic itself. Old tropes based in conspiracy theories, such as that the Jews produced the virus, or that the Israelis were not contaminated, that they own the pharmaceutical companies selling vaccines or medicines, somehow taking advantage of this terrible situation. These were spread in many countries throughout the Americas. I myself wrote an article in a Brazilian weekly magazine that I called it The Virus of Prejudice in June 2020, showing how much hate speech was spread along with the COVID-19 pandemics. More recently, anti-vaxxers were seen wearing yellow stars in a preposterous comparison to Holocaust victims. The second one is related to the consequences to the Jewish communities around the Americas and around the world of the manifestations about the conflicts between Israel and Hamas last May. In the USA, Jewish diners were attacked at a restaurant in LA. A Jewish man was attacked in New York, and there was in-person harassment in Florida. In other countries, such as Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, and others, manifestations equating Israel to Nazi Germany and David stars to swastikas were seen on the streets and in social media. In some countries, there was even some government involvement in this campaign. The ideas that Jews around the world can be collectively held accountable for what happens in the Middle East reached a new dimension. We don't see emigres or refugees of other countries being targeted for decisions made by their original governments. It's surely a double standard, and it may be called, without reservation, by its name. It is anti-Semitism. And if we see the last FBI report about hate crimes, despite being only 2% of US population, 60% of the hate crimes based on the religious reasons in the United States were directed against Jews. But my friends, not everything is bad news. Regarding the positive side, I would like to mention some initiatives that were taken during these last years in our continent, and especially in my country, Brazil, such as we produced a guide to identify hate speech. This was done by the Jewish Federation of Brazil and a law school in São Paulo, trying to help legal people like lawyers, police officers, prosecutors, and judges to identify hate speech when it manifests itself. I would be glad to share its English version with you and the people who are in this conference. We signed memorandums of understandings with social networks, and this is a thing that I should recommend to every Jewish and civil rights and civil society organizations all over the world with social media providers such as YouTube and TikTok to be recognized as trusted flaggers, meaning that when these organizations identify and can report anti-Semitic posts, they have them monitored and removed with a fast-track mechanism by the social network. The Brazilian Supreme Court recently equated racial insults to racism, which has a more severe treatment and legal sanctions, not being subject to statute of limitations. This provoked in the Brazilian Senate an adoption of a new legislation that will equalize both crimes. As I mentioned to my friend from North Macedonia, Brazil was accepted as a member observer member to IHRA. North Macedonia was accepted as a fully member, and we hope this spreads to other countries, making it a world organization. The Electoral Court in Brazil took a firm stand against fake news and automated messages. Teaching of Holocaust was included in the 9th year of Brazilian schools as mandatory, and this shall be expanded to other countries in the region and around the world. A bill is being debated in the Brazilian House of Representatives in order to combat fake news. In fact, it's broader than that, also addressing hate speech and prejudice posts. One of the more recent trends is related to the connections between hate speech and anti-Semitism online. And this debate about hate speech and its regulation has been gaining new contours with the changes in the media, especially in the internet. If it was already controversial in traditional media, it has surely taken a new dimension in the dynamics of online communication. Ladies and gentlemen, deepening the discussion about the concept of hate speech and seeking to offer sufficiently clear parameters for its identification in concrete cases is a task that we cannot avoid anymore. Respecting the specificities of each national legislation, we believe the key will be a combination of self-regulation within the networks, legal regulation by the public sphere, and court decisions by each country, respective courts and Supreme Courts. 48 countries have been trying to regulate social networks since 2019. 24 have already approved or submitted propositions to moderate content in the internet. Maybe it's already time for us to think about an international convention on the subject. Thank you very much, and have a fruitful and positive discussion.
Thank you, Fernando. В нашей конференции большое внимание уделяется вопросам обмена опытом между иностранными партнерами по данной проблематике, потому что exchanging experience
on this topic. And of course, when it comes to this negative thinking that brings forward all of these awful aspects, well, I think there are no differences when it comes to different nations, and that is something that we as all nations encounter. Therefore, I believe that we should take positive thinking to counteract this negative thinking, and only through that we'll be able to disseminate positive experience throughout the world, and there'll be no difference between different nations and governments. Therefore, we are very pleased that our agenda is supported by many nations. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Jovan Tegovski, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of North Macedonia.
Presented. Thank you.
Distinguished panelists, respected participants of today's and tomorrow's conference. Combating anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism means a call for permanent action in our everyday life, in our education process, focusing on the youth, in our political, social, cultural life. The challenges we are faced with should encourage all of us to think about the use and abuse of power, the role and responsibility of individuals, organizations, and states when human rights are not respected and violated, but also should make us more vigilant to promote the value of existence, and to respect diversity in pluralistic societies. I believe that today's and tomorrow conference proceedings will provide additional impetus to our collective and individual efforts to effectively preventing and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, Holocaust denial, and distortion, hate speech. The anti-Semitism, being traditional or contemporary, in a number of countries continues to be promoted, openly or undercover, not only by the extremist political parties and their leaders, but also, in some cases, by certain mainstream political parties and leaders. The anti-Semitic manifestations are not exclusively done by extremist groups, but they are often a wider phenomena, including in schools. They originate in different social and ideological groups and different sectors of society. They are dramatically spreading via the social networks that do not recognize borders. Our response and action to these phenomena must involve all relevant state and non-state actors, policy and decision makers, law enforcement agencies, educational institutions, different ethnic and religious communities, civil society organizations, media, academic community, cultural, sport, and other organizations. And the extremely important area of the social networks that have failed so far to take effective measures to prevent the misuse of their platforms and digital form of spreading anti-Semitism that does not recognize borders, as I said. Allow me, dear friends, to share with you a few observations on the anti-Semitism in the region of the Western Balkans. The findings of the research on the anti-Semitic discourse in the Western Balkans conducted by the International Republican Institute in 2020 showed that the anti-Semitic speech in online media did not exceed 4% of examined content, and that the anti-Semitic narratives were not substantially different from narratives in other parts of Europe and mainly contained traditional conspiracy theories about control of world financial markets, as well as modern conspiracies such as those claiming intentional development of COVID-19. Besides conspiratorial content, violent and vulgar anti-Semitic language was common. What seems to be specific to the Western Balkans region is the use of anti-Semitism as a tool to sow or intensify regional conflicts. Out of almost 10,000 relevant search results examined from all 7 countries, 1.67% contained implicit forms of anti-Semitism and 1.45% contained explicit anti-Semitic statements. The remaining 96% presented news or views on anti-Semitism in the Western Balkans or contributed to general discussion of news covered related to the Jewish community worldwide. Anyhow, relationship between the Jewish communities and other groups in the population are largely good, and anti-Semitic instances in online media did not exceed 6% of the examined content. At a glance, these numbers could suggest that anti-Semitism does not represent a vulnerability or threat in the Western Balkans. However, the research indicated several threats that might affect the increase of the anti-Semitism as well as susceptibility to other forms of extremism. I would just mention a few: the use of anti-Semitism in local politics and the utilization of international anti-Semitic narratives as a tool for amplifying other political narratives, limitations in legal and law enforcement frameworks and the accessibility of extremist literature, the need of modernization of school curricula with a focus on Holocaust education, human rights, and hate speech, as well as raising the general public awareness. Distinguished colleagues, the Republic of North Macedonia, as a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, is fully committed to respecting the fundamental human rights and freedoms of all its citizens, members of various ethnic and religious communities living on its territory. The respective members of our Jewish community are one of them. Aware about the importance of all these issues and guided by these commitments, the government of North Macedonia, in close cooperation with the Jewish community and the Holocaust Memorial Center of the Macedonian Jews, as well as with other governmental institutions, civil society organizations, and international partners, invest continuous efforts to appropriately address these challenges. Let me illustrate our work with few concrete examples. The government has adopted the two IHRA working definitions, one on anti-Semitism and the second on Holocaust denial and distortion. All government departments and bodies have been tasked to consider and make use of both definitions in cases and situations in their respective area of competence. The translated text of both definitions and the accompanying documents were uploaded on the web page of the Bureau for Development of Education, with instructions for the schools to make use of it. The President of North Macedonia, Pendarovski, has presented 3 pledges at the International Malmö Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism, held last October, and those 3 pledges concern the visits to the Holocaust Memorial Center of the Macedonian Jews in Skopje will become a mandatory activity for primary and secondary classes where the Holocaust is a part of the curricula. The Holocaust teaching content will be enhanced with parts on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion, and the government will adopt the 3rd IHRA working definition on anti-Gypsyism, anti-Roma discrimination. We have translated into Macedonian, Albanian, Serbian, and Turkish language the IHRA recommendations for learning and teaching about the Holocaust, the ODR UNESCO teaching aids on addressing anti-Semitism through education, the IHRA document recognizing and countering Holocaust distortion, recommendations for policy and decision makers. And we have organized a number of educational and training conferences. To mention the last one, practical implementation on the 3 legally non-binding IHRA working definitions in multicultural societies, lessons learned, best practices, steps forward, held last May 2021. The government amended several important laws in the areas of racism and racial and all other forms of discrimination, xenophobia and intolerance, and has accepted the initiative of the Jewish community to amend the criminal code of North Macedonia in 3 main areas: prohibiting the use of National Socialist symbols, Holocaust and denial and distortion, spreading anti-Semitism, envisaged to be adopted by the Parliament by the end of this or the beginning of next year. Ladies and gentlemen, our efforts and the results achieved in the areas to combating anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion, as well as in the areas of Holocaust remembrance, education, and research, have recently been appropriately recognized and valued internationally. As my colleague from Brazil mentioned, North Macedonia was admitted as a 35th full member country of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance at the plenary meetings held on 9th November 2021. Our lasting and firm commitment to continue working in these areas is not only a political determination, it is our moral duty and debt to 7,144 Macedonian Jews deported and killed in the Treblinka Nazi death camp in the spring of 1943. and it is our pledge for the young generations. We do believe that our efforts will bear fruit, and this precious fruit are the new generations who will give bigger and more substantial contribution to preventing and combating this phenomena. Allow me to conclude with a quote of the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. The rise of anti-Semitism anywhere is a threat to the people everywhere. Thus, in fighting anti-Semitism, we fight for the future of all humanity, end of quote. Let us work for a future that will never forget the past, so that it will never be repeated ever again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jovan, for your great report and for this kind of job being done. And мы продолжаем, и нам предстоит
And with this, we are going to continue. We are going to have several online speakers, and I would like to give the floor to Jasminka Dzumhur, an Ombudsperson, Institution of Human Rights of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Спасибо большое. Добрый день.
Thank you very much.
I would like to thank organizer on this opportunity to share some experiences from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And also I would like to congratulate on organization of this event. I think it is my personal assessment that is a very important moment when we are looking globally situation related to human rights. There is perception that is important to think globally, but at the same time to acting locally. And based on that approach, I do my presentation. And definitely, I would like to refer on countering xenophobia, antisemitism, and racism, but from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ladies and gentlemen, the scale and dimension of human rights violations during the Second War causes creation of human rights standards with aim to prevent human rights violations. In addition to existence of such human rights standards, serious human rights violations, including genocide, happened during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the period 1999-1995. The Dayton Peace Agreement yesterday was, we remember, anniversary when was signed date of Dayton Peace Agreement, was signed in December 1995 and ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Annex 4 of this agreement adopted and privileges the three main ethnic groups, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, labeling them constituent people. Furthermore, the Constitution refers to 17 national minorities, including Jewish and Roma, as others, and denies them the right to run for the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the House of Peoples, the upper house of parliament. We still have not ended second-class status for Jews, Roma, and other minorities, 11 years after the European Court of Human Rights found that Bosnian constitutions violate their rights. There is no implementation of the European Court decision, the case Sejdic-Finci. As Bosnian citizen, I'm not happy that first decision in according of a protocol within European Convention on discrimination was adopted related to Bosnia and Herzegovina. As estimated, 400,000 Bosnians, almost 12% of the population, cannot run for president of parliament because of their religion, ethnicity, or where they live. The Constitution also bans people who don't wish to declare an ethnic identity from running for the highest office. The presentation of some observations and recommendations of UN treaty bodies and ECRI, I would like to introduce some issues which clearly show a current situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina related to xenophobia, antisemitism, and particularly racism. In its report of Bosnia and Herzegovina, ECRI strongly reiterated the recommendations made in 2010 report, in particular concerning the urgent need to end all forms of segregation in schools, including two schools under one roof, and monoethnic schools at the application and further development of the common core curriculum. ECRI also strongly recommended ensuring inclusively and non-discriminatory learning environments in all schools and the removal of any symbols that represents any ethnic or religious bias. My previous speaker exactly spoke on importance to make changes in education, particularly when we are speaking on young generation. And I also think that this ECRI recommendation should be looked in that context. Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in their recommendations from 2018, recommended to authorities of Bosnia and Herzegovina that country remains divided along ethnic and ethno-religious lines, and such divisions have become commonplace, as illustrated by recurring ethnic tensions, including at the political and administrative levels. The committee also concerned that such divisions permeate ethnic and national groups across the territory and pose obstacles to decision-making processes and efforts towards more confidence building through the adoption of laws, institutions, and strategies that foster integration and reconciliation, and therefore hinder the fight against racial discrimination. The committee urged the state party to take all necessary measures in consultation with all parties across the territory to overcome ethnic tensions and divisions which hinder the legal, institution, and policy advancement towards a more integrated society and reconciliation and racial discrimination. The committee recommends that state party take concrete measures to ensure to find a solution to promote a more integrated society based on values of equality and non-discrimination, and in which all citizens take part irrespective of their ethnic, ethno-religious, or national affiliation. When we are speaking on hate crime, the committee also expressed concern about reports of racist hate speech and discriminatory and disparaging statements in the public discourse by public and political figures. When we are speaking on UPR, I also would like to say that during the UPR process, several recommendations issued to authorities of BH to enforce some necessary measures to combat discrimination against ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, in particular with regard to persons who don't qualify as Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, by removing discriminatory provisions from the Constitution, the election law, and other legislation, and implementing the judgments of European Court of Human Rights, such as the Sejdić and Pinci. There are also requirements to amend further Constitution in order to eliminate discriminatory based on membership on the ethnic groups in public political life in terms of access to employment in the public spheres. Finally, today we have serious debate in our society related to issues from the past. A particular problem presents denial of war crime, including genocide. Several times had been proposed a law on binding genocide denial in the Parliamentarian Assembly of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Last time it was in April 2021. The Bosnian Parliament's House of Peoples, Serbs and Croats lawmakers voted against changes to the country's criminal code to prohibit the denial of facts about Srebrenica genocide. This was the reason why the High Representative, based on his authorization defined by the Dayton Peace Agreement, imposed legislation binding genocide denial in Bosnia and Herzegovina on 23rd July this year. This was the reason why parliamentarians from entity Republika Srpska decided to block functioning the institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Since that time, Bosnia and Herzegovina is in a political blockade. When we are speaking on hate speech and non-tolerance, I also would like to mention a situation related to migration, because Bosnia and Herzegovina is transit country on Balkans route. Since 2018, in BH, approximately on daily basis is present between 7,000 and 8,000 of migrants. They are exclusively accommodated in one of the BH entities, Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, while authorities of Republika Srpska clearly stated that they are not ready to accept migrants on own territory. I can't speak more on the position of LGBT and other groups, but definitely hate speech, particularly hate speech through social networks, without having defined that issue in our legislation, it's a serious question, not only for Bosnia and Herzegovina authorities, but also for all of us. And we are discussing that issue in context of different networks of national human rights institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to conclude. Bosnia and Herzegovina and its citizens are going through a difficult period because of the following. Denial of war crimes, including genocide, despite the verdicts of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Non-recognition of victims through not adoption of the law on victims of torture in accordance with recommendations of UN treaty bodies. The glorification on convicted war criminals through the erection of murals or in other ways. The presence of the hate speech in public discourse. All of the above affects the difficulties in the branch of trust, which poses a constant threat to peace. Facing the past, accepting the facts, recognizing and protecting victims, condemning crimes is the only way to build lasting peace. Therefore, we need to ensure in our societies implementation of accepted international human rights standards with aim to prevent conflict. I think that the lesson learned from Second War, and particularly way how Germans met with past, it is a lesson learned which we must transfer to our societies. Thank you once again for this opportunity, and I will continue to think globally and act locally.
Thank you, Jasminka, for your support and for your professional approach.
And we are ready to connect with Katharina von Schnurbein, European Commission Coordinator on Combating Antisemitism and Fostering Jewish Life.
You're online and we're ready to hear your report.
Спасибо большое. It's a pleasure to be with you and to zoom in a bit on some aspects of the European Commission's first ever strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. I believe this morning Vice President Jovan already informed you about the broader framework of it, and so I will give you in addition some snapshots of what we think is important also with regards to our international partners. The strategy is a result of the close cooperation with Jewish communities that we have significantly intensified since December 2015, when this post of Coordinator on Combating Antisemitism was created, and which gave me the possibility to link up with Jewish communities in all the different member states, also beyond, and also the global and the umbrella organizations of the Jewish communities, which to some extent are also based in Brussels. We had a formal consultation process where all those interested, Jewish or not Jewish individuals or NGOs, could complement and contribute their ideas. And we have tried to take those into account as much as possible when we drafted the strategy. And I believe this is really key with anything that we do with regards to anti-Semitism, to do it in close cooperation with the Jewish communities and those concerned. The strategy is called a strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. We think that these two aspects really need to go together. It is essential to show not only the negative aspects of how of the difficulties of Jewish life in Europe today, but really also to show the diversity of Jewish life, and not only current Jewish life, which is very important and I think very vibrant also across Europe, but show the long tradition and the cultural heritage and the contribution of Jewish life and Jewish communities throughout the centuries. And this richness and the contribution they have made in different fields will increase the understanding also of what the Holocaust meant for Europe. I think these aspects have to go together, and so we have incorporated all of these aspects in the strategy. The aim of the strategy is formulated as putting an end to anti-Semitism. And we know that this is, of course, a very ambitious aim, and anti-Semitism has been around for 2,000 years. So in order to put an end to it, we know it's not going to happen possibly in the course of this strategy, which is laid out for 9 years. But we are convinced that we need to keep the aims high in order to make progress. And in the end, this is what we want. And European society free from anti-Semitism, and a situation where Jews can live their lives just like anybody else, free from security concerns and free from threats to their religious or cultural traditions. This strategy is also the result of close cooperation with the European Parliament, with representatives from national parliaments. The European Parliament passed its first ever resolution on anti-Semitism in 2017. And then we worked closely with the Council of the European Member States, where 2 declarations were passed in 2018 and 2020. One on the security of Jewish communities and combating anti-Semitism, and in 2020 on mainstreaming the fight against anti-Semitism across all policy areas. And I believe this is an important second aspect when it comes to drafting national plans and to engaging in concrete actions against anti-Semitism, to do it in close cooperation with the national institutions and the structures that are there, in order to make sure that all these areas take in account the fight against anti-Semitism when they make policies, when they produce funding programs, and give the opportunity to Jewish and other organizations to engage in the fight against anti-Semitism, because it's only through this so-called mainstreaming that we can go into the broader society. And in the end, this is what we need. We need to reach the general public, because fighting anti-Semitism is not a responsibility of the Jewish communities, obviously. It's a responsibility of the states, of all of us, and of general public, and it's also in all of our interests. And this has, I think, been behind all the actions that the European Commission has put forward in the strategy. The European Union in the strategy is based, or the European strategy, is based on 3 pillars. First, the prevention and combating anti-Semitism. Secondly, securing and fostering Jewish life. And thirdly, education and research on Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and Jewish life, and then also Holocaust remembrance. And all of these pillars, and I will give you examples of individual initiatives later, are to be reflected also in our external cooperation with partners, with international organizations. And we really rely on this close cooperation, including with Israel, for example, but also with international organizations such as the OSCE and the Council of Europe, where Russia are also member, and the UN or UNESCO. This is key to ensure that on all these levels we closely work together. So I believe by working closely together in that way, we can aim for going in a way beyond Europe and ensure an improvement for the Jewish community around the world. We have very good political momentum. As you know, the Malmö International Forum on Combating Antisemitism and Holocaust Remembrance encouraged member states, member states and also the participating states to come with concrete pledges. And we have seen a wealth of concrete pledges from states, which very well go together with the aims of the European Commission in this strategy. Before I go into some of the areas, let me make a small sidestep just to say how symbolic it is that this conference is held from Moscow. Because in a way, Russia is the cradle of modern Zionism, with the refusniks before the Iron Curtain fell, and then the immigration to Israel and other places in the 90s and after. But at the same time, the Soviet Union also became a source for anti-Zionism, based also on the visit of Golda Meir when she came to Moscow in 1948. And she was greeted enthusiastically by the Jewish community, which gave a pretext to Stalin to regard and to portray Jews in general as illoyal to the state in which they live, and create the notion of anti-Zionism, behind which anti-Semitism can still hide today. And I think this is it is key to understand that according to our surveys, among 16,500 European Jews, where they see Holocaust denial and distortion as the most disturbing form of anti-Semitism, Israel-related anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is in fact the form of anti-Semitism that is currently encountered most. So this to ensure that we tackle these modern forms of anti-Semitism, I believe, is key, and the fact that that you are taking this initiative, I find very significant and very laudable. In the strategy, we see all forms of anti-Semitism as equally pernicious. We want to make sure, under the first pillar in particular, and it's been addressed by several panelists before, to tackle online anti-Semitism by responsibilizing the platforms through also legislation that is underway, by ensuring that member states bring online perpetrators to court based on existing legislation that is possible already, and to boost capacity among those NGOs that can recognize illegal anti-Semitic hate speech and also harmful speech and conspiracy myths. We think we need to address Holocaust distortion and denial in particular, and support independent research to avoid false rewriting of history. We do this together with the IHRA, but also through the European Holocaust Remembrance Infrastructure, in which we have invested since 2010. And we want to create a network of sites where the Holocaust happened to show how local it was. The Holocaust was a European tragedy, and it was instigated and perniciously planned by Nazi Germany, but it could not have happened without local collaborators. And this is, I think, painful because they were possibly at the same time also victims themselves. But we need to ensure that in 10 years' time, when there will be less and less survivors with us, we will remember the universality of the Holocaust for creating human rights, for creating the democratic system that we have today, and therefore need to be aware of the fact that it happened around us, and And as Primo Levi says, because it happened, so it can happen again. So to be really vigilant when we see anti-Semitic incidents around us, and to ask the question about what is the right reaction to these things. Finally, it was anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. And this is why we think that we need to understand much better what contemporary anti-Semitism looks like, also in Europe, and what how Jewish life is developing. We very much look at the moment to research coming from the US and also to the UK, but we think that we should have a special EU research hub in which we will connect researchers researching on anti-Semitism and Jewish life and help them to create synergies, help them to boost their visibility also, and to share their research. Because in order to further create fact-based policies, we need such research. So this is another important aspect that we will address in this strategy. I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present these aspects, in addition to what Commissioner Jourova said this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Katharina. We are grateful for your report. Thank you so much. We're happy that you are with us. And
I would like to invite the next speaker, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination of the European Parliament, Mrs. Petra Bayr. Over to you, Petra.
Спасибо. Добрый день. Мне очень жаль, что я не
Hello, and I am so sorry that I cannot be with you in person.
Austria went into its fourth complete lockdown. And on Saturday, the so-called Freedom Party of Austria, a far right-wing party and the third largest at the National Assembly, in cooperation with several citizen movements from the extreme thinking scene, called for a demonstration against corona measures. About 40,000 people followed the call and marched through the city center of Vienna in several marches until the evening hours. As in previous demonstrations against corona measures, according to police, there were several alleged violations of the Austrian Prohibition Act that penalizes the glorification of the Nazi era and Holocaust denial. Such demonstrations are sometimes a reason for the Jewish community of Vienna to send out security warnings to its members because of anti-Semitic incidents. This also happened before this weekend. The demonstrations represented a renewed challenge for the Jewish community, says Oskar Deutsch, the president of the Viennese Jewish community. A challenge, however, that was mastered very well. The security people of the Jewish community, the police and the federal army managed the well-organized protection of the synagogues. Anyone who wanted to visit the synagogue on Shabbat could do so. However, there were also anti-Semitic insults on the open street on Saturday. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the Austrian Antisemitism Reporting Center has recorded a significant increase in such incidents. Jews, unfortunately, must be particularly vigilant, but at the same time, the community knows that it is on the side of the democratic majority, and so it will not be intimidated. The president of the Jewish community describes the demonstrations themselves as far from reality. They were organized and led by people with partly anti-Semitic delusions and declared neo-Nazis. Although he assumes that not all participants, of course, are right-wing extremists, they are fellow travelers in the truest sense of the word. But all of us know extremism is at its most dangerous when it encounters with such fellow travelers. The COVID-19 pandemic has had negative consequences on equality and non-discrimination throughout Europe. It has affected more the most vulnerable parts of the population and exacerbated hate speech, including face-to-face interactions in the media and online. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were widely shared on social media during lockdowns, accusing notably the Jewish communities of having created the virus, of spreading it intentionally, or of benefiting unfairly from treatment and vaccination. These ideas were also present during demonstrations against public health measures taken by governments to limit the spread of the virus, not only in Vienna, but all over Europe, and as we learned earlier today, all over the world this year and in 2020. Some demonstrators wore the yellow star and with the word unvaccinated, the same yellow star Jews were forced to wear during the Second World War, made references to the Holocaust and comparison between the deprivation of Jewish people liberties during the Nazi regime and the restriction of movement during lockdowns, or when a proof of vaccination is required for access. This comparison is unacceptable. Mr. Fernando Lottenberg already mentioned this before, and this is not only valid for the Americas. The pandemic has shown that our societies are not as open and inclusive as we thought. And the pandemic has been a magnifying glass for all forms of discrimination and othering. In France, clearly anti-Semitic slogans have been displayed during anti-health pass demonstration, and the slogan "But who" has become an anti-Semitic code. Names of members of the government are displayed and their alleged Jewish faith criticized. Anti-Semitic incidents are reported daily. In Germany, the Federal Association of Departments of Research for Research and Information on Antisemitism, the so-called RIAS, reported 1,909 anti-Semitic incidents in 2020, of which a quarter was connected to COVID-19. As an explanation, and please really as an explanation, not as an excuse, we can consider that people want certainty in uncertain times, and that current times are particularly uncertain due to the pandemic and other international events. Many people's accusations against Jewish people as creators and spreaders of the virus respond to the need to find and name a scapegoat. ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, underlines that the internet was the primary vehicle of anti-Semitism and that Holocaust distortion had increased dramatically since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Accusing minorities, often the Jews, of conspiracy theories is a historical anti-Semitic trope. Conspiracy theories are promoted to divide societies. The study on rise of anti-Semitism online during pandemic, analyzing data in France and Germany, shows clearly that there was a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic posting, a 7-fold increase in French language accounts and a 13-fold increase in German accounts between the first 2 months of 2020 and the first 2 months of 2021. Specific anti-Semitic narratives are linked to the pandemic, and at the same time, the report explains that there has been a proliferation of classical anti-Jewish tropes with conspiracy theories of how Jewish people are ruling political and financial institutions as well as the media. The online platforms should take responsibility for removal of anti-Semitic content. Against this background, I have been elected rapporteur of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on the report on combating anti-Semitism in Europe. The report, among other issues, will look into how to enable Jewish life in Europe, and I will try to find ways how to raise awareness among those who are hard to reach, for instance, among football fans. Enabling, and Katharina von Schnurbein already mentioned that before, enabling manifold and vibrant Jewish life and ensuring the security and the protection of Jewish people is of utmost importance and should be the responsibility of states. In some Council of Europe member states, Jewish children attend private Jewish schools paid for by their parents because they feel they provide a safe environment for them. A considerable number of Jewish families have left Europe to look for safety in Israel, Canada, or the United States. Anti-Semitism threatens the stability of societies and poisons democracies. Anti-Semitism is a threat to a society as a whole. Anti-Semitic and racist incidents are regularly reported in the field of sports and particularly football, where anti-Semitic words or chants are still sometimes heard, as well as the display of flags or other hateful gestures. Sport has an essential role to play to promote Council of Europe values and should be a vector of respect, positive attitudes, and inclusion. It can contribute to setting the tone with regard to the fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance, and could therefore be useful in combating anti-Semitism. And I'm very happy that we managed about 2 weeks ago to organize an international conference in Vienna where the Austrian National Football League signed the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism as an underlying basis for their future work against anti-Semitism in Austrian stadiums. I hope that I will finalize my report before summer 2022. If you want to share any best practice examples, I'd be very happy to receive them, as I think that all European countries should learn from other experiences with the goal to make Europe a peaceful and secure place for everybody. The organizers have my email address, so if you would like to share any thoughts with me, you are very much welcome. Spasiba za vaše vнимание.
Thank you, dear Petra, and thank you for your readiness to share information. We're grateful for your participation. Нам в завершение пленарного заседания предстоит еще услышать два коротких видеообращения, очень интересных, которые поступили в адрес участников пленарного заседания. Первое, попрошу включить видеообращение уполномоченного федерального правительства Германии по вопросам еврейской жизни в Германии и борьбе с антисемитизмом. Felix Klein.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Mr. Felix Klein.
The question of how we can effectively counter anti-Semitic hate speech, racism and xenophobia is one of today's most pressing issues. It worries me to see how the tone of public discussions is becoming increasingly aggressive, abusive, and often hate-filled. I have experienced this in Germany. You have probably had similar experiences in your own countries too. Modern means of communication, such as the internet and social media, make things easier for those who wish to spread hatred and incitement. National borders are no obstacle for them anymore. This makes it all the more important for us to work together to resist this global alliance of inciters of hatred. To do so, we need to share our ideas and measures with each other internationally, and of course, we all need to be aware of and attentive to the various destructive forms this inhumanity takes. That is why today's event is so important. The hostility that is generally directed against members of minority groups in our society places a heavy burden on those people in their daily lives. It also endangers our ability to live together as a society. This hatred has a very destructive effect on democratic structures as well. This means that it is ultimately a problem for all of us, regardless of our nationality or faith. Hatred and incitement denigrate people on the basis of their views, appearance or origin, their religion, their gender, or their sexual orientation. This hostility is also increasingly directed at government representatives and public institutions. The German government first created my position, the Federal Government Commissioner for Jewish Life in Germany and the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, in 2018. You may be wondering why this decision was made. What's so special about anti-Semitism? Ladies and gentlemen, anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination are similar in structural terms. Typically, certain characteristics, most of which are negative, are attributed to an entire group of people. The rise of racist discourse in the 19th century led to pseudo-scientific justifications for modern anti-Semitism. And many Enlightenment philosophers held anti-Jewish views which they claimed were based in rational arguments. That is to say, we are dealing with a phenomenon that goes back hundreds of years. What is unique about anti-Semitism is that, unlike racist or xenophobic stereotypes, it does not solely malign Jewish people as inferior, but also characterizes them as all-powerful and overly civilized. In present-day anti-Semitic thought, the Jews often represent the abstract nature and values of the modern globalized world. This reduces the complexity of our modern societies to a simple image in which powerful Jews secretly pull the strings and control the economy, the media, and/or political institutions. In this way, anti-Semitism also serves as a way to make sense of the world and often appears in connection with conspiracy theories. We can see this currently in the protests against the measures to stop the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, the crimes committed by Nazi Germany are a constant admonition to us to take responsibility for maintaining our ability to live together as a society. Never again can things be allowed to go so far. Hatred of Jews must be combated at an early stage wherever it appears. This expectation should not only be a part of public officials' understanding of their own role. It is just as important for civil society to take responsibility for standing up against every form of exclusion and denigration, rather than leaving this task to the affected minorities themselves. The strength of a society is reflected in how well it protects its members, especially the most vulnerable of them. In Germany, we are trying to intensify close cooperation between government and civil society organizations. Good prevention efforts can be facilitated, particularly through support for civil society and its excellent preventive education projects, as well as by including Jewish organizations. For years now, Germany has been experiencing an increase in anti-Semitic and racist incidents. Two serious attacks particularly shocked the public: the fatal attack on the synagogue in the city of Halle and the murderous racist attack in Hanau. In response, the federal government convened a cabinet committee to fight right-wing extremism and racism. As a result of its work, a year ago, this committee adopted a package of 89 measures that showed its determination at the highest political level to step up the fight against right-wing extremism, racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of group-focused enmity. This effort is a cross-cutting task that must be taken into account in every policy field. I hope that all of you will enjoy a lively and interesting discussion today and a successful conference. Thank you very much.
Коллеги сейчас вместе с нами онлайн и также смотрят
выступления. И
сейчас наше завершающее
give the floor to our last speaker, Mikhail Mirilashvili, member of the Presidium Bureau of the Russian.
Дорогие участники конференции, уважаемые коллеги, один из наиболее актуальных вопросов еврейского мира — динамика современного антисемитизма. Мы с осторожностью наблюдаем за антиеврейскими явлениями по всему миру, в том числе в странах бывшего Советского Союза. Несмотря на значительное снижение зафиксированных проявлений насилия
of recorded anti-Semitic violence, as marked by the observations and monitoring by the Eurasian Jewish Congress in the post-Soviet countries, there are still frequent acts of vandalism, monument desecration, and cultural desecration. And also we mark with regret that anti-Semitic rhetoric is still in use. Anti-Semitic history, anti-Semitic stories, and stereotypes, including those related to history of the Holocaust, are still widespread by mass media in some countries of the region. We see the attempts to glorify and rehabilitate Nazis and their allies, including those famous for their anti-Semitic rhetoric. Therefore, combating this is an important activity of the Eurasian Jewish Congress, as well as preservation of historic memory, as well as active combat of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The Congress is closely monitoring the public mood, monitoring reports of expert organizations of Israel, the EU, and the United States of America, which in turn this data become basis for scientific publications as Eurasian Jewish research. Recently we have issued a compendium of articles of scientists from Russia, Israel, and the Ukraine, dedicated to the review of tolerance in the post-Soviet space. We believe that the detailed analysis presented in this compendium will be a matter of concern and study for politicians and the community at large. I would like to use this opportunity to thank our partners and colleagues from the Russian Jewish Congress for the organization of this extremely important conference and wish all of you successful and fruitful work. Thank you. And closing our plenary session, I suggest our respected speakers who are here and speakers online to applaud each other for great job. Thank you.